So I keep getting these calls from housing assistance networks. I don't know if you guys get these calls, but I just got a call saying that Brian Curtis and I live in Indiana, right? I've driven through Indiana, I think, once, but for some reason somebody's got me on a list where I have a home in Earl Park, Indiana. If any of you guys live in Earl Park, anybody ever watches this video that lives in Earl Park, please give me a call. I want to know what Earl Park is like. So you might be thinking, okay, this is the river video, and why does he have a plate of spaghetti and an appendix picture and a picture of an enema on this page? Well, this is my story. This happened to me when I was young. I was 14 years old, and this is one of the most profound experiences that I've ever had. I would rank it maybe second or third. It was a very interesting experience, so I'll get started. I think it was the summer of 1988, and we had just moved to our house down by the river, where on the homepage you can see that tree that's down there. I used to go down there every day because it was just me at the time, and I think my cousin Bill hadn't moved home. He moved up from California later, but at that time it was just me and my brother Ken, and Andy was still real little. Andy was only 2 or 3 years old, or he was 3 years old. He was born in 1985. So I would go down to the river all the time, but for whatever reason, all of a sudden I started getting where I couldn't have bowel movements anymore, and I hadn't gone to the bathroom in a couple of days. I think it'd been 3 or 4 days, and I was starting to get worried. So I told my mom, I was like, uh, I haven't gone to the bathroom in a while, and it doesn't feel like I need to go to the bathroom. So she took me to the hospital, and I had kept eating. And they checked me out, they turned me on my side and had a doctor stick his finger in my butt and check. And he's like, well, you're either constipated or you have appendicitis. I was like, okay. So they prescribed an enema, and I had to go home, give myself an enema, and I think I was 13 years old, right? So I wasn't comfortable giving myself an enema, but I read the instructions, and my mom threatened me if I didn't do it, then I was going to have to go back to the hospital, and they were going to have to do it there. And so I did it, but nothing really came out. It was just water. And so I think it was either that evening or the next day I sat down and I started eating, and mom would make spaghetti probably 3 or 4 times a week because that's all dad wanted to eat. Dad only wanted to eat spaghetti. So I was in the middle of eating a plate of spaghetti, and I think I got almost all the way through a plate of spaghetti, and all of a sudden I had the most vicious pain in my abdomen, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't do anything. I was just curled up into a ball, and I told mom, I need to go to the hospital right now, because the pain was so excruciating. So she rushed me to the hospital, and they took me in, and they looked at me, and I was just begging for pain medication. That's all I cared about. And they put me on an IV, put me on a drip, and they told me that they were gonna, put me under the knife the next morning. Well, in the middle of the night, they woke me up early, I think, because my heart rate went through the roof and my appendix burst. So they operated on me in an emergency, took my appendix out, and they cleaned me up as well as I could, but I had enough infection in my system where I was very sick. So I'll go to the next slide. I spent uh, about a week in the hospital. I think I was there for 7 or 8 days. And I was about halfway through, and I guess a girl had seen me on the floor, and on this floor is where they were doing appendicitis. So everybody that was on this floor had gone through that surgery, but as most of you know, an appendix removal is usually a next day surgery. But I was really messed up. I had a ball of infection in my abdomen, and I was losing weight fast because I couldn't eat. My temperature was high, and I remember they would keep asking me what what I would rather do, take a suppository or take a needle in the butt cheek. And I would always choose a needle in the butt cheek. I didn't want anybody sticking pills up my butt, but I guess it works just as fast. But so I just spent basically 5 or 6 days withering away, just, with pain medication and an IV drip. And I think I went from about 100, at the time I was 13, almost 14. I think I was probably around 160 pounds maybe. And I went down to around, I think I weighed 110 pounds when I got out of the hospital, after my fever broke. They wouldn't let me out of the hospital until my fever broke and I had a bowel movement. So I had my first bowel movement after about 6 or 7 days, and I was able to eat. As soon as I was able to eat and my fever broke, then I was able to go home. And it wasn't until the last couple of days I could even really get out of bed and walk. I was so weak. So that experience was very trying. I had a girl, maybe I mismentioned it, but I had a girl see me about 3 or 4 days, and she saw how sick I was, and so she sent me one red rose. And I never saw her. She was only there for a day, but I'll never forget that experience. I was like, hey, there's some girl here that cares about me, and it really stuck in my head. It was because before that I'd only had one girlfriend, and I think I was very young. I think I was 6 or 7. I think I was in first or second grade. It was Jessica Brown. Jessica and Jennifer Brown had moved to Benton City, and I dated. She wanted to go out with me, and so I said, "Oh, sure, I'll go out with you." And after a week, she started to kind of boss me around. I was like, "Oh, sorry, that's it. I don't want to date you. I don't want to be with you anymore." And so she got really upset, and my her friends, got after me and said, "Why don't you want to be with her?" And he's like, I told her, I said, "Well, I'm just done with her. I didn't want to be bossed around." And so, when you're that age, you don't really care anyway. You just want to, play out in the park with your friends. And so, but, back to the story, this hospital experience was very, very trying for me. I had stitches where where my stomach was opened up, and after about a month of taking probably 6 or 7 different antibiotics, my infection wasn't going away. It felt like it was about that big around in my abdomen, and it went up my right side and then across the top of my abdomen, and I could feel it. It was a hard infection. And so after I got my stitches out, shortly after I got my stitches out, a hole opened up in my scar and started to ooze that infection out. My body was finally starting to get rid of that infection, and I had to keep it cleaned out to make sure that holes didn't close, to make sure that infection stayed out. And so I couldn't stand to do it. So my mom would stick a Q-tip in that hole and keep cleaning it out, and it was pretty deep. It wasn't a shallow thing, so it was pretty gross. But the infection did come out, and that's, I did recuperate from it a little bit. And I would say it was about a month later that, I was just very unhappy because of what I had just gone through. It was a terrible experience. And so we'll go to the next slide. We had just moved down to the river, and the river was still waiting for me down there. And as soon as I got better enough to where my scar was healed up and I felt like I was finally on the mend, there was a rock on the other side of the river that I always didn't like it being there. I guess you could say the rock was maybe that point in my life where, I just didn't like having to go by that rock every time. And, that experience that I had just gone through, I guess you could say that it was kind of metaphorically the same thing. So I wanted to move this rock in the middle of the river. And the river was about waist high where the rock was at. So every time I'd float by, I couldn't get a grip on it. It was a big round boulder. It was pretty good sized rock. And so I could never stay still enough. The river would always wash me by it. And so I couldn't get a grip on it to try and move it. And so, I went back to the house and I grabbed a maul and a big T-post and a bunch of baling twine, because at the time we had cows out in the pasture and we had baling twine there. So I went out above the rock and I drove the T-post into the river and to where it stayed, and then I tied some baling twine close to the top of the water level so I could tie off to it. And I measured out the baling twine so I was pretty close to where the rock was going to be, so I would stay where the rock was at. Well, if any of you know anything about rivers, this is probably the stupidest thing you could possibly do. Kids drown every year because they'll get hung up on submerged tree branches, especially during flood stage. When the river comes up, you know, you can get hung up on a tree underneath the river, and it'll keep you underwater. And you know, once you're in the current, there's really no way to get unhooked, and that's how you drown. So as soon as I had the rope or the baling twine around my waist and I got tight, I immediately went underwater. You know, I just remember being submerged underwater with about this much water above my head, and the baling twine going straight over my head. And at first I started struggling around a little bit, trying to figure out how I could get off of it. And of course, you know, it's a tight knot on a piece of baling twine. I didn't have a knife. There was no way for me to cut it. And I stopped and thanked for a second while I was under the water, and thought and realized that there is really no way for me to get out of this situation. You know, in order for me to pop myself back up, you know, I had no foothold. My feet were dangling in the current in front of me, and there was no way for me to stand up. And so I remember just giving up. I just thought, you know, there's no way for me. I don't know how I'm going to get out of this. And I have gone over this memory many times in my head and thought exactly what was that last thought that I was thinking about. And I just remember being relaxed and just completely relaxed and just completely letting go and just saying, okay, this is it for me. And the next thing I knew, I was standing in the river next to the T-post, and all the, you know, I was still tied off with the rope around my waist, but it was loose because I was closer to the T-post. And I started looking around, and I didn't know where I was at. You know, I was a little bit confused because the last thing I remember is I was underneath the water. And so I remember there was a dog barking on the bank, and I really didn't know, had no idea what happened. So I untied the baling wire. You know, it took me a little while because the rope was tight, because I had just gotten it really tight. And I pulled up the T-post and I walked out of there with my maul, and I didn't go back down there for quite a while. And I remember, you know, just not thinking about that for a long time. And I realized I tell this story. I started to tell this story again within the last year or two, and I'm always curious to see what people's reactions are. You know, what do you think? You know, what do you think happened there? And you know, most people's answer is pretty much the same. And I think I know what happened, but I'm not going to share with you what I think happened, because I think I know what my last memory was. But I'll leave that to you. You know, rivers are very sacred things. You know, they're the cardiovascular circuit of the planet. You know, if you really look at it, and there's a reason why they call it the river of life. You know, as long as you stay in the middle and you just keep going, you really don't know where you're going. You kind of have some idea, and you can see the horizon, but past the horizon, you really have no idea. And rivers change daily. Any of you that have lived on a river understand that the river changes every day, and it's not the same any one day. Every year it changes. The banks change, and there's always people on the bank that are watching you go by, that decide that that's their good spot and they're going to stay there. But you know, it's always been my choice to just stay right in the middle of the river, because I would rather have that feeling of being in the current and getting to my destination. And it's okay that I don't know where I'm going, but I always feel supported. And as long as I'm in the river and I don't try to anchor myself in the river, then I won't drown. You know, don't ever try to anchor yourself in a river. That's a really bad idea, because the river always wins. It doesn't matter. Even if you're in a boat, eventually the river will win. And so, you know, that's my story. I hope you guys maybe think about rivers more and understand how rivers are a very spiritual experience. Anybody that I love to whitewater raft, and all of my friends who are whitewater rafters understand there is a spiritual quality to rivers where you kind of have to let go of control and just do what the river gives you. If you just take what the river gives you and don't get scared and don't get paranoid, then you're always safe. But the minute you start to get paranoid and you start to get fearful, a lot of times you'll make decisions that are against the current of the river, and it's not usually in your best interest. So I'll leave you guys with that. And love you, Devin. If you're ever watching this video, you understand what I'm talking about. That's my river story.